All right, guys, we're here with Mark Waters, Director, Project Manager and Senior Inspector with Weather-Tight Solutions, NZ. He's been in the industry for around 17 years and he's a specialist in this area. Thanks for joining us, Mark. How are you?
Good, Zane. Good to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So we'll get straight into it. So, lenders tend to get a bit nervous when lending on a property. Let's say it was built between 1990 and 2004 and has that monolithic cladding. A weather tightness report from someone such as yourself is usually a condition of a loan in this situation. And much has been talked about in the media with the size of eaves and monolithic cladding in homes of this area. When someone is in the early stages and specifically sort of simply looking at houses on the internet, say Trade Me, for example, what would a buyer look for or avoid initially?
Yeah, well, we have the perception in New Zealand that if it's plaster, it must have problems. Either they're there and haven't been found or they're going to happen. Whereas any house out of any material can have issues. But if you're looking at a detail type orientation, you think about, well, does it have a very low pitch roof? That could be problems. Does it have parapets around the roof? Does it have enclosed balconies, so decks over living space with membranes? Particularly if they've got tile over them, they can be very difficult to repair, and when you're repairing them you cause more damage, so end up being very expensive. And really important thing is, no matter what the cladding type, how close the cladding is to the exterior ground levels. We see far more ground moisture drawing into a building because of insufficient clearance than we do necessarily from moisture coming in a building up higher and tracking down. Obviously looking for any sorts of deterioration, large cracks, small cracks, discoloration to the material, and also looking for repairs. Does it look like a building's been maintained over time, or does it look like a whole lot of repairs have been done just prior to sale? Those are some things to really look out for.
Okay, excellent. What should a home buyer do if a property looks like a leaky home, or if there's suspected water tightness issues through an initial building inspection on a property that they're looking to buy? Yeah,
so there's the initial inspections that are done by any weather tightness inspector are non-invasive. So they're using two different types of meters usually. One, a moisture meter, and oftentimes thermal imaging. And all they do is trying to get a datum on the property. Are there anomalies? Most of the moisture meters that are used don't actually even check for moisture, they're checking for density. The theory is that if material's wet, it will be denser, and that's where you get a more elevated reading. So if they get a report back that shows anomalies or shows deterioration, the next step should be invasive testing, because that's that hidden componentry in the wall that we want to know about, and we need to know whether it's been wet or damp, but it's still structurally sound, or whether it's at the other end of the spectrum and it's starting to decay. So a good weather tightness inspector that specialises in invasive work will receive a report, generally from another source. Look at that. Depending on how much information is in that other report is how accurate they can work out a methodology for that invasive testing. Mm-hmm. That then is put through to the vendor to get their permission. Once their permission is granted, then that work happens. And the invasive testing is really to determine what is the likely scope of works, so therefore what are the likely costs involved to get it. And it goes up in several levels. The first level is invasive testing, which is more of a keyhole surgery, to what we then call destructive testing, which is removal of internal or external sections of cladding or linings. And obviously, the more you can expose material, the better you know what's happening in the building. But obviously, vendors don't like that level of destructive testing until you get certain way down the path. So invasive testing is that initial indication of where a scope of works is going to be.
Okay, brilliant. And say besides monolithic cladding, are there any other cavity or cladding systems that can all cause issues for weather tightness?
Yeah, so we have this perception in New Zealand that if it's a house is built between a certain time period, or if it is plaster, then it's got issues. And a lot of the banks don't even acknowledge that other building types, other eras, can and do have problems. It's like saying only one make of car breaks down and you can drive everything else into the ground and never maintain it and they'll be fine. Every cladding type has its own issues. Weatherboard, brick and tile, doesn't matter what it's made out of. So I think that perception of plaster is incorrect. We need to look at every building and work out how well was it designed? How well was it built? What are the materials that we use? What's the quality of those materials? And what's been the ongoing maintenance of that building? And when you put all of those things together, that's when you can determine the condition of a building. And it's about, a good report should show how the building is on the day of inspection and also identify what's upcoming general and preventative maintenance. You might get a report that says the building's fine, but if it needs a full repaint in the next 12, 18 months, by the time you might have to scaffold a building and paint it, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars. Yeah. And if the purchaser isn't aware of those things and they think, great, here's my budget, good, got my mortgage, and then they've got to come up with all of this extra money, that's just stress people don't need.
Yeah, definitely. Now let's say a house is confirmed as a leaky house. There's a lot of advice out there is just don't touch it. Is a confirmed leaky home? Would it be worth buying if the price is a bargain for argument's sake?
Yeah, I think you're right there. And just to quantify things, we also think that if a building's built with a cavity system, that it's the silver bullet and it won't have any issues. That's not correct. We can talk about that later. But again, if a building has issues, look, nothing's perfect. There's no perfect buildings out there. Even brand new buildings that I'm inspecting just signed off have issues. Council can't cope with its amount of inspections, and a lot of time it relies on large companies to self-certify. That's a potential recipe for disaster. But if you've got a building that's got confirmed issues, that's when you go back to that invasive and destructive testing. And the best way to work it, and a good inspector should be involving the vendor in part of that process and the agent and saying, look, we've identified initially some non-invasive anomalies. We're officially informing the agent in writing and the vendor of these things. So then the agent has to disclose those to other purchasers. But it also means if you're try and work hand in hand with the vendor and say, look, it's in everyone's best interests to identify the issues clearly and accurately. That means that any negotiations for repair costs or replacement costs are more accurate. Rather than having to go to a worst case scenario type price in the first place, you say to the vendor, allow us to do this type of testing so we can be more accurate, and it's in everyone's favour. Once it becomes known the extent of the damage, that's when you start to work out, well, is it worth going forward with this? And even if we identify it clearly enough, will the bank still loan on it? The building code makes things, I think, more tricky than it could be. And I think that's a response to the fact that a lot of early reclads were done as a like-for-like replacement, same details, same materials, and they failed again. So council said, well, you can't do that, right? Yeah. So whereas you might think some targeted repairs would be the easy way to go, in a lot of cases, it actually would require a council consent. So the costs then skyrocket because you've got plans that need to be drawn up, maybe engineering, consent fees. So it really needs to be looked at as in the whole of the issues, the quantum of it. But certainly once it gets beyond targeted repairs, you're really then talking full reclad. It pretty quickly goes into that category. And a lot of times, unless a property has specific features, the reclad just doesn't add up. So oftentimes you might find a property, it might be 2 stories or 3 stories now. A reclad might cost more than a new build, but you find that if you rebuilt it, you maybe now wouldn't be able to go to 3 stories. Or that the height to boundary issue means instead of being maybe 1 or 2 meters from the boundary, now you might have to be 3 or 4 meters of the boundary, which would reduce the size of the home. Therefore, a reclad's worth it.
Yeah.
If those things don't come into play, then oftentimes a complete rebuild is a far more effective and cost-efficient way of going about it.
Wow. Yeah.
So therefore, you're generally then looking at, if a house is in that condition, it only really adds up if it's a land value purchase.
Yeah. Okay. So we've kind of established that, aside from homes built in the early 90s to mid 2000s, in reality, leaks can come from any property at any stage, even brand new.
Yes.
Is there anything that people should be aware of? Well, other things that such as condensation or showers or
Yeah. So oftentimes people ring me up, or even people that have got their own home. We do a lot of pre-sale inspections as well, which is really useful. It gives the vendor an opportunity to understand their house. And oftentimes you have people say, well, I don't notice any musty smells or wet smells. I don't see any staining on the walls. And generally, by the time you've got to that point, the framing is so rotten, it's almost sometimes even like soil in the walls rather than timber. Wet areas inside houses, bathrooms, laundries, are actually far more insidious, and most people don't even think about them. But if you think about exterior moisture coming into a building, that happens when it rains, so not every day. If you think about a leaking shower, depending on how many people live in the house, how often the bathroom's used, that shower might be used 2, 3, 4, 5 times a day. And if it's leaking, and it might only be a tiny bit of water every shower, but the framing timber that's soaking up that moisture can't dry out. And if you get timber wet and you keep it wet, doesn't matter what the condition is, as long as it stays wet, it'll rot out really quickly. So, and if you think about a bathroom with a shower that might be leaking, it might be a first floor shower, it might be then damaging the mid-floor, might be damaging walls. The bathrooms are generally fully tiled, so the cost of repair in those areas is significant. So that's something to really be aware of as well. Condensation's a big issue. In New Zealand, we keep going on about insulation. And yes, insulation's great. It's like having another blanket around you. But if you put it in incorrectly and you don't allow the house to breathe, you can get condensation forming inside your walls, which will rot your walls out from the inside. Also, we don't talk about mechanical ventilation as well as we should, and not necessarily positive pressure systems, which are bringing air from your roof space, but balanced air. So it's fresh air in from the outside, remove the stale air, and those sorts of systems, they dry the house out. So if you've got a dry house, it's a healthy house. You don't then have mold issues. You don't have condensation damage. And mold issues in New Zealand are really significant. Time and again, I talk to clients and you go in, particularly in rentals, and you see black mold forming on windows, backs of curtains, behind furniture. And you talk to people and oftentimes they do have health issues, or their children do. And this is something we need to be really aware of and tackle correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm guessing, ventilation is going to be key in that sort of situation.
Yes.
You mentioned the black mold and around the curtains and the windows. Are there any other telltale signs that a buyer should look for in an open home or a private inspection in their initial look at a property to check for this sort of thing?
I think a really quick way to look is certainly the windows. We inspect some properties and it's green and growing and really funky on there, and you go, gosh, that looks like a science experiment. To other properties where you just see a few specks of the mold, but you think that, all through the property, you add that up and, that's quite a bit of mold that can be in the area. And if you're moving into a house that has mold in it, which unfortunately is all too common, you're moving your furniture, your furnishings in there, and if you then start to dry it out without having cleaned the mold away correctly, the mold then is in a now drier environment. It knows it needs to recolonize, so now it starts to send out more spores. Actually, when it's damp and growing, it's less dangerous than when it's drying and trying to recolonize. And when it's recolonizing, it's looking for new damp spaces, and that's in your furniture, new curtains, etc. So identification and treatment's really important.
Yeah, great. And I guess there's always going to be certain people that want to maybe possibly cut corners in this process. Maybe get cousin Dave or Uncle Roger involved. How would you, talk to a buyer around using a professional?
Yeah. So look, oftentimes I get people say, we've got a friend who's a builder or a relative who's a builder, and we'll have them inspect it. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how good your relationship with them is and how good a builder you think they are. If their insurance isn't specific for them giving professional advice for giving a building inspection, then they shouldn't be doing it. Because the best of friendships can be ruined when down the line you figure out that your good mate, the builder, got it wrong, and you've got tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of issue in the house that weren't correctly identified. I had an inspection just last week where actually the client said they'd gotten their builder to look at it. Their builder had said the building had a full cavity system, and he'd already given that report. He'd written a report and handed it through to the broker. The bank came back through via the broker and said, well, my report had differing information about it not being on a cavity. Turned out the builder didn't know what he was looking at. He didn't know how to identify it. And he'd incorrectly identified the house as having a full cavity system. Now, that's a really significant issue, but the bank then immediately turned the property down because it said, well, it doesn't have a cavity, and the other problems that we'd identified were now much more significant. That's an extreme example, but at any level, you've got to be careful who's giving you the advice and how qualified they are to be doing it.
Definitely. And, when should a buyer look to engage your services? Obviously, we've got valuation costs and all that sort of things in the mix, and, building inspection, possible initial building inspection. Where in the process is it best to kind of engage a professional like yourself?
As early on as possible. I mean, look, I get a lot of feedback from clients or clients ringing me and asking for an inspection. I ask them how long their due diligence period is, and oftentimes, particularly in the Auckland market, it's very short. Yeah. And without being unfair to agents aren't your friend. They're not there to get you into your dream home and fulfill all of your wishes. They're basically there to get their commission as quickly as possible. So for them, forcing you into a short due diligence period, it suits them. So then you try and think, well, how do I sequence these things? And you've got your meth testing, your valuation, and a building inspection. I always say get the building inspection done first, because if the building inspection doesn't add up, what's the point of getting the meth test and the valuation? If you get them all, I get people trying to book them all on the same day, or they've already had the valuation to see if that adds up. Well, you should already know where your budget sits with the bank. And if the house is at a certain level, that should already be taken care of. So you inspection first, and then you go with the valuation and meth testing as required from there.
Yep. Brilliant. Totally agree. And how can people get a hold of you if they want to engage you?
Yeah, well, if they want to look me up on the website, that's weather-tightsolutionsnz@gmail.com, or they can give me a call on 021 163 6232. I'm happy to spend some time talking to them further.
Yeah. Awesome. Appreciate you joining us today, Mark. Thanks very much.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.